Hi, Neil. It's Exhausted Thursday. How are you?
Hey Claire, how are you? I'm a lot better because, I'm on the West Coast, so I don't have to stay up late like you've been doing to watch all the DNC stuff.
I know, and it's been really interesting watching the journalists freak out, particularly on the first night. They were all saying, what's going on? Are they trying to hide Biden? And, I finally thought, well, actually, the states we're trying to influence are Arizona and Nevada and
Hmm.
Wisconsin. And it makes perfect sense to stick everybody in prime time for the Midwest and the West.
Yeah, they're not trying to reach the New York City market.
Right. Yeah, I think the Harris campaign has all of us. So there's so much that has happened this week, Neil. I think we need to sort of boil it down to some of our favorite moments. What are some things that have struck you about the first three nights of the convention?
Well, love seeing the Obamas. I thought both of their speeches were, I mean, just great to see them and really effective speeches. No surprise there. Oprah last night was really exciting for me. I have to say, I was really moved and blown away, really, by Tim Walz's speech in a way that, so much has been made of him as this really effective campaigner, and certainly that's a big part of why he was brought onto this ticket. But I felt like he sort of outperformed my expectations of what he was going to do last night. And I'm really interested to see how that plays with the voters he was trying to reach, which are sort of the undecideds, the independents. I think those are the voters that this convention has really had in mind in terms of the programming around what they've done this week.
Yeah, there was a journalist who referred to Walz's speech as Wednesday Night Lights.
Mm,
And I thought
I love that.
bringing his championship football team on the stage was
Incredible.
genius, just genius. But, I also thought, and there have been a number of moments like this, Neil, that moment when he looked at his family and said, you are my heart. I love you so much. And of course, his kid Gus jumped in the air and said,
Yeah.
"That's my dad," and he was crying, and so which apparently Ann Coulter made fun of him for.
Mm.
Lovely. Um, but it also occurred to me that every night we have seen couples embracing each other, kissing each other, saying "I love you." And that is something that never happened, not once, at the Republican convention.
Well, not surprising given the two people on the ballot, right? I mean,
Right.
what is Trump's emotional connection to his family? None. JD Vance is this very awkward, unnatural political figure. So obviously, when you have two candidates that have no sort of emotive ability, you're not going to really build on that, I don't think. But yes, I think even more so, what was striking is the way that that's been showcased at the DNC for the past week. And I think, again, it speaks to the strength of those, not only the two people on the ticket, but the other people they've brought onto the stage and their ability to connect, with their family members and the people they love, and also how they can project that to the American audience. And I think that's natural on their part, but I also think it's very strategic, right? This is all about normalizing the Democratic ticket for undecided voters, for people who don't like Trump but can't imagine themselves voting for Democrats. I think that again has been the recurring message of this week, and it's really effective to demonstrate that. I think through these examples of the family, in the case of all these different people.
Yeah, and of course, Pete Buttigieg played an incredibly important role last night in that when he talked about being a teenager, knowing he was gay, and thinking he was never going to have a family and that he was always going to be alone. And that not only plays a role in, making the Democratic Party the natural home of gay and lesbian people, but it also sort of reaches out to people who may be dismayed or taken aback with the ways that gays and lesbians and transgender people have gone mainstream, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think Buttigieg is such a he's the perfect messenger for a sort of soft progressivism around these cultural issues. that I think plays well in the suburbs. And, that he can sort of couch it, or he can sort of present it in the example of his 3-year-olds trying to get them to wash their hands before they eat dinner, right? This isn't some radical message about trans rights, right? Like, those are not my words, right? But the way that like they could be
Yeah.
perceived by a lot of Americans, this is sort of just a soft, gauzy image that most Americans are okay with, that he can remind them of, again, in contrast to the sort of extremist rhetoric and extremist messaging that the Trump campaign has, centered around.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, thinking about emotion as well, I don't know what channel you were watching on, but after the night that the Obama spoke, night two, at the end, of course, we were all of us on the East Coast exhausted already, and everybody who's working the convention must be more than exhausted already. But what Michelle Obama said about how Black people don't have the luxury of failing,
Yeah,
that actually really moved me at the time. And then, as the PBS NewsHour was closing out its broadcast, Jonathan Capehart, who, the guy has 3 jobs. I mean, he works for the Washington Post, he works for MSNBC, and he's a pundit on the PBS NewsHour. And Jonathan Capehart was really struggling to keep himself together and talked about how that really spoke to him and how it spoke to his sense of, uh, you know, never being allowed to fail in the world. And then he started to cry. And I kind of thought, well, if the Democrats are making journalists cry,
yeah.
maybe other people at home are beginning to feel like these politicians are a little more real too.
Yeah, and that's such an interest. I didn't see that, but last night after Walls's speech, I was watching MSNBC, and Jen Psaki, am I getting her last name right? The
Yep.
former Biden director of communication spokesperson, she was in near tears and got choked up speaking about Walls and his son Gus and the whole family's response to each other. And so, yeah, you see these hardened political types being moved to tears by all sorts of different examples at the DNC, and you have to think that that's resonating with Americans at home. I mean, one of my group text exchanges last night, I had a good friend who's a former Republican and certainly not anymore in the Trump years, saying that she was moved to tears by the Walls family, and I think you can imagine that happening in millions of homes across the country.
Yeah, I think so too. And if we can push it just a little bit, I would also say their courage and Gus's courage in taking a disabled child out in
Yeah.
public with the kinds of disabilities he has, which must make large crowds particularly difficult for him. And I thought that was interesting because on the one hand, white Christian evangelicals and conservatives actually do believe in the lives of disabled people having dignity, and it's one of the arguments against abortion. Why wouldn't you raise a
Right.
disabled child, because that life has dignity too. On the flip side, though, I can't actually see a Republican politician taking a disabled child out in public.
I mean, I don't know. I think you can imagine a Down syndrome child being, part of
Sarah Palin.
yeah. Well, okay, good. Being a part of a Republican family, and lots of messaging around that
Yeah.
that underscores the very point you made. But I think, aside from white evangelicals or even Republicans, I think again, an example like Gus has to resonate with every American family, because there's either someone within their family who has a similar characteristics, or it's the next door neighbor, or it's a good family friend. I
Right.
mean, this is just this is just something that resonates, I think, with really every American. And I think it was beautiful to see, but I also think it was probably highly effective with so many folks who think that Democrats are unrelatable, right? And I think, again, Walz has been brought into um, to sort of conquer that unrelatability with so many Americans. This, Midwestern white guy, coach, teacher, uncle, that sort of figure, neighbor. I mean, that was the word he kept saying in his
Yeah.
speech. Neighbor, not voters, but your neighbors. I think that was deliberate. It was, I think, also highly effective.
Yeah. And I think the Democrats have done that in a variety of different ways, which is to keep sort of pushing this idea of community back into political discourse, that we all live in community and that living in community requires compromises, it requires tolerance, it requires a desire to help others even at your own expense.
Yeah, and let's talk about the language and the imagery that has been recurring throughout these 3 days or 3 nights of coverage. It really struck me. Almost all of them start with the letter F. So these are the
Yeah.
words and the images that I've heard over and over from the DNC this week: family, faith, the flag, armed forces, and the big one, freedom.
Yeah.
Now, none of these words or images are inherently conservative or Republican. And yet we know from the last, 40, 50 years of American political history, the right and Republicans have had a sort of monopoly around these words and these images. And also, I think the Democrats, in many ways, ceded that language and that imagery to Republicans. But I think in the era of Trump and the sort of extremism of Trump and to use a word, the weird preoccupations of Trump and the Republican Party in recent years, there's just been this wide open ground that Republicans have given Democrats to reclaim or to claim so many of these American symbols and this American discourse for their own and
Yeah.
to put obviously a democratic spin on it. But what an effective, again, messaging move to reach Americans of all stripes around these, deeply American words and symbols. And it felt completely natural to me. I mean, I
Yeah.
think about Wes Moore last night talking about his military service, and then Pete Buttigieg coming out and doing that as well. And so, the sort of language of flags, of armed forces, of freedom. I mean, I'm really curious what you think, Claire, about this use of freedom
Yeah.
in the DNC and just in the campaign in general.
Yeah, well, I mean, they've seized the word of freedom, and then also sort of remade it a little bit. I mean, Walls was talking last night about the freedom of kids to go to school without worrying about being shot.
Right.
That there are aspects to freedom that are not about protecting my freedoms, but a freedom that is common to the whole community, that is about our welfare as a society.
Yeah, I thought that that was one of his most impactful moments
Yeah.
because I think, freedom is one of those words that can sort of be stripped of its meaning when it's just sort of
Yeah.
invoked over and over again, which I think is, very much what sort of happened on the right. But he used it to say, like, Republicans mean it so that the government is free to sort of interfere with your life. And
Right.
I think that was a smart, characterization of how the Republican Party has actually operated. Um, but to then say, children should be free to go to school without being shot down. I mean, to take one of those words and to bring it into such particular use as this example that I think every American, especially every American parent, has legitimate fears about, is to remake this word in ways that I think are highly resonant to right now and are, instead of stripped of meaning, actually deeply, deeply meaningful and pointed.
Right. And it really takes us back to Roosevelt's four freedoms, right?
Right.
Which is
Yeah.
the birth of liberalism, the first two of which are freedom from want and freedom from fear.
Right.
And that is what the Democratic Party has embraced really since the New Deal.
Mm-hmm.
So, Neil, I want to move on to our virals, but there are two other things we have to do. The first is the roll call.
I mean, have you been watching it over and over? I have.
Yes, and
Yeah.
and Georgia in particular. I mean, Georgia just
So
like
fun.
killed it. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, as a political junkie, who was one since I was really little. I mean, I remember watching these as a kid, when actually they were televised.
Yeah.
They kind of haven't been in recent years because they're really boring. But it used to
Right.
be this sort of, from the great state of, Kentucky, or excuse me, the great Commonwealth of Kentucky, or the great state of Florida, and there would be, someone there maybe in a particular outfit that sort of, was a stereotype of that state. And you might say, from the place of bluegrass and the Kentucky Derby. I used to love that stuff. But again, that sort of moved off of television coverage in large part
Yeah.
because of transformations around the convention itself, and this, not being a
Right.
time in which a nominee is actually chosen. But wow, whoever came up with this is an absolute
Yeah.
genius. And I think
Yeah.
this whole DNC has been remarkably choreographed.
Yeah.
But this was unbelievable. I mean, it immediately went viral. Everyone was talking about it. Um, and I think that the videos that sort of do the play-by-play of the Republican vote tally and the Democratic one, only underscore the difference here. What
Right.
do you think, Claire?
Oh, I thought it was amazing. And in addition to the music and the beats, I mean, I was just up dancing now and
So
then.
fun.
It was so fun. But what I also loved is that the delegations often handed off the mic to a Black woman.
Yeah.
And the delegations also, and this is like the nerd version of why I thought it was so great, the delegations also talked about history. And most delegations talked about some aspect of women's history or of Black history that had
Yes.
happened in their state. So Wes Moore was talking about Sojourner Truth and Frederick
Mm-hmm.
Douglass. Kathy Hochul, who is possibly one of the most boring speakers ever in politics, Kathy Hochul was talking about Seneca Falls.
Right.
So I thought the bringing in of these historical snippets to say, actually, we got here on the backs of other people, often people who couldn't vote at all. I thought that was incredibly smart.
So smart. And also in a way that doesn't feel sort of, I don't know, overly preaching or,
Hmm.
scolding, but like celebratory.
Right.
And I think, that particular moment underscored another word that has been coming up over and over again. And it's the word joy, which
Yeah.
doesn't start with an F, although I guess
Yeah.
another word might be fun.
Yeah.
But it really struck me that joy is a word that's being spoken so much in this convention, because I think, and again, this is where Democrats are so brilliant right now. This idea that the message is like, we love this country, Americans. We believe in the
Yep.
country. We believe in the future, and come to our side if you love this country. If you're a
Yep.
patriot, right? That's
Yep.
one of the things that have been said over and over, that this is a celebratory, joyful moment, even as we guard against a real threat, a threat of authoritarianism and, an end to American democracy that a second Trump administration would represent.
Yeah, and I kept thinking, in terms of that word joy, of Tara Hunter's wonderful book about Black women in Reconstruction,
Mm,
the title of which is "To Joy My Freedom,"
yeah,
and joy, of course, has an apostrophe in front of it. But it was a real quote from a woman who was asked, "What do you want from this
yeah,
political moment?" And she said, "To joy my freedom." And I sort of feel like that's the theme right now.
yeah.
So Neil, quickly, what do you want from Kamala tonight?
Well, I'm not sure what I want. That's a good question. I think it would be nice to know what is the sort of the clear policy agenda of this
Hmm.
administration. How much does it look like what we've seen in the first Biden term? Is it, a continuation of sort of the legislative goals and the policy goals of Biden, or does she have a real different vision
Yep.
for the future? I especially am interested in to hear her thoughts. I don't know if she'll go there, but her thoughts on foreign policy seems really important right now.
Hmm.
Um, I, I'm just wondering how meaty this will be on a policy level, or if this will be more sort of symbolic. And there's obviously a lot of historical significance to point to here, which I think she will. But those are the things I'd like to hear more about. How about you?
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think she's got a tough job because even though she has become very well known very quickly, actually about half the country still doesn't really know that much about her. I mean,
Hmm.
if they're not political junkies like us, they haven't been hoovering up every single story about Kamala and her career and so on. So she's got to give a compelling political biography for those people. She's got to give a compelling personal biography, and as you're saying, she needs to talk about policy. I don't know whether foreign policy is something she can really light on that well. I think finessing the Gaza situation is
Yeah.
incredibly difficult at this point, particularly since at last count, the DNC has decided not to have one of the uncommitted delegates speak in prime time. I don't know whether they've changed their mind about that. I do think one of the things she needs to emphasize is that when people are asking for an economic plan, the Democrats are actually talking about the economy when they talk about childcare. They're talking about the economy when they talk about housing. They're talking about the economy when they talk about elder care. You know, what gets people into the workforce and keeps them in the workforce and pays them enough to take care of the people they're responsible for, that is a major part of the economy. I think the housing question is a biggie. I mean, you know, if they let me up on the stage in prime time, I would explain to them that building houses drives the rest of the economy, and that was
Hmm.
explicitly why they put that in the GI Bill. Because when you buy a house, you
Right.
buy durables, you buy furniture, you buy lawn equipment, and so on. So I think if she could reframe the conversation about the economy around people's daily needs and say, you are the economy. The economy is the government working for you to help you live your lives the way you want to live them.
Hmm.
I think it's a tough job. I don't know whether anybody could do it, but if anyone can, I think she can.
Yeah.
So, Neil, we're going to go to what we want to go viral this week. And I'm going to change the tone a little bit from joy. But I read this amazing graphic novel this week by Ari Richter that is called And Never Again Will I Visit Auschwitz. It's about becoming obsessed with his family's history during the Holocaust and how he sort of, develops this huge family archive and spreadsheets about where everybody was and how he learns how to tell their story and how complicated that story is. There were two things that really grabbed me about it. One is how different the Holocaust looks when you are looking at very specific people, right? And I think,
Hmm.
the Holocaust sort of re entered popular culture around the Diary of Anne Frank, when, back in the 60s, people were reading a book about a little girl and how she experienced this huge calamity. So that was one of the things that really grabbed me about it. The other thing was very personal, which is I did visit Auschwitz. My partner and I went when we were in Poland 5 or 6 years ago, and it was a searing experience. I mean, just a searing experience,
Hmm.
including one of us, I will not say which one, fainted in the middle of the
Hmm.
tour. It was that stressful. And the guide said, actually, this happens all the time.
Hmm.
People are just overwhelmed by the enormity of the evil in that place. So part of what was interesting to me is he goes to Auschwitz and has a totally different experience. Actually, he thought the tour was terrible. He thought it was messy. He thought it was a rotten exhibition, and so on. And I don't know whether it's because he did it at a different time, because of course the Polish government passed a law saying that you're actually not allowed to blame Poland for the Holocaust anymore, and you have to talk about how much Polish people suffered. Um, but it was interesting to me. I just assumed that that traumatic way of experiencing a concentration camp, a death camp, would be universal, and it's not universal at all. So I recommend to people that they read this book. It's a graphic memoir, but it's really not for children. Neil, what do you want to go viral this week?
That sounds incredible. What I want to go viral this week is a piece that came out a couple of days ago in the Made by History section at Time Magazine by Becky Nicolaitis. And the title of it is To Understand What Could Happen on Election Day, Understand the Suburbs. Probably many viewers will be familiar with Becky's name. She is our leading historian of the American suburbs, certainly one of our foremost historians of American suburbs. She actually has a new book out that just came, I think, out in the last year or so. And this piece does a lot of interesting things. It really looks at the long history of suburbs in the Los Angeles area. So I really love that as a newer resident of this city. Becky, of course, has lived here for a very long time and is,
Yeah.
the biggest expert on Los Angeles and its development and certainly of the suburbs around this metropolis. But one of the things she talks about in this piece and that her recent work has done is like there's this notion in American politics that the suburbs are this place of whiteness, right? That like the
Hmm.
whites fled to the suburbs in the mid-century, and it's this place of whiteness. And she's shown in her research and in this piece how racially diverse the suburbs are. But one of the
Right.
things that she points out in this piece is that racial diversification of the American suburbs hasn't necessarily changed the politics of these places. That if
Mm.
anything, the politics of these places that are very much built upon notions of private property and of safety, and of keeping others out, that those politics have been picked up by the different racially diverse people who have moved into them. And I think there's such interesting examples that she shows throughout history of this, but especially around the politics of immigration, where you see in these suburbs a lot of what would be characterized as anti-immigration politics emerging,
Hmm.
even from majority Latino suburbs, for example. And that ultimately we have to understand these suburbs and the politics that emerge there to really make sense of what happens in any given election, but particularly on this one. So I'll just say that I think there's a lot more history in this piece and a lot more sort of political wisdom in it that's really worth um, checking out the piece for. So again, it's in Time Magazine from Becky Nicolaitis. And the piece is titled To Understand What Could Happen on Election Day, Understand the Suburbs.
Neil, that's wonderful. And you're just right about Becky's work, including a lot of those suburbs, as you're saying, aren't white. And it's a much more complicated demographic than journalists really are ever able to take the time to tell us about. Neil, thanks so much for your company. And I will see you in Chicago virtually, the two of us. And I look forward to talking to you next week.
All right, you too. Have a great week and try and get some extra sleep, staying up these late nights for this convention.
Thank you, Neil. Talk to you soon.
Bye bye.